couldn't be more excited for us to continue the discussion. Hold your thoughts. I know there's still a lot of people that wanted to contribute to that conversation. I'm sure that this talk that Dr. Asma will give will provide even more food for thought for us to formulate our opinions on this topic. So with that being said, Dr. Asma, I pass it to you. And after Dr. Asma's talk, we will have the opportunity to reconvene again for further discussion.
Just to clarify, so how much time do we have now? I can try to shorten my lecture. Are we going up to a certain hour? And should I keep an eye on the clock then? Is Mahmoud here?
Yes, I'm here. We have around 1 hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. That's about as long as my lecture.
So that's completely fine. I would rather give precedence to your lecture than the discussion. We can just move the discussion to another time. So please feel free to, give us the full length of what you prepared for the cohort today, and we'll look forward to discussing it at a future time.
All right. So we're talking about 2:30 roughly. Is that right? Just so I have a ballpark idea of what time you're shooting for. Mahmoud, can I go on till 2:30? Is that about right? All right, I'm going to aim for that. So
I think you can assume that. Yes.
All right. So let's try
sure.
sharing my screen again. Here we go. All right. Can everyone see the screen now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So the debate about whether the Quran upholds patriarchy or undermines it by promoting gender egalitarianism has not died down since the late 19th century, when such questions began to be increasingly asked in the Muslim majority world, as strong currents of reform and self-introspection began to take hold during the period of European colonial occupation. European colonizers, suffering from an excess of an assumed cultural and religious supremacy, mocked Islam and Muslims for allegedly being intrinsically hostile towards women. From this vantage point, they tended to portray cultural, localized practices that were sometimes repressive towards women as scripturally mandated practices, and essentialized Islam in this manner. Their criticism catapulted questions of women's agency and conceptions of gendered roles to the forefront of Muslim internal discourses that were focused on religious and social reform in the colonial context. In the post-colonial context, Muslim women scholars and social activists continue to focus on the women question through the 20th century up to our own time today. And I think you got a very good sense of the historical progression of these ideas through most of the 19th century and the 20th centuries, when Islamic feminism began to take hold. The Muslim women scholars and feminists typically regarded the Quran as their primary source of personal and legal empowerment. And through their own rereadings of relevant Quranic verses, they began to push back against what they clearly considered to be misguided and harmful interpretations of the Quran by many male exegetes over the centuries that had robbed them of their God-given rights. More broadly, the question that continues to be asked until today is whether the Quranic text can be understood to support an ethics of egalitarianism in which gender is not a marker of ontological, moral, social, and legal difference. Muslim gender scholars and feminists have typically extracted a gender egalitarian and woman-friendly meaning from the Quranic text and regarded the classical exegesis produced by male Quran commentators in the pre-modern period as undermining this fundamental egalitarian ethos. Prominent among this group of scholars have been Amina Wadud, I'm sure you've heard her name, and Asma Barlas, two American women scholars who wrote pioneering works on the topic of women's issues from a Quranic perspective. Compelling as their arguments have been, not everyone has been persuaded by their narratives. And Wadud and Barlas have been even accused by a few of having misread and misrepresented the Quranic text itself. I will not rehash these arguments here. I've summarized the arguments and counter-arguments in my recently published chapter on this topic in my edited volume, The Oxford Handbook of Islam and Women, which came out in late 2023, and one can access this information there. What I would like to do instead is to weigh in on this fraught issue based on my own reading of the Quran and the exegetical literature around it. I will discuss key verses from the Quran that are often invoked in the context of women's rights and agency within the Quran, and offer a critique of predominant understandings of these verses and how some of these understandings can be challenged through a more holistic engagement with the Quranic text. I want to begin by asserting that on the general topic of equality and egalitarianism, it cannot be said that the Quran is not concerned with it, as some have maintained. On the contrary, the Quran evidences a strong concern for setting up certain criteria for gauging equality versus inequality. Gender, however, is not one of them. Neither is race, ethnicity, color of one's skin, or socioeconomic background. Criteria that we usually invoke in the modern period, especially in the West, to discuss issues of inequality. Rather, the possession or non-possession of specific moral attributes and the commission of certain pious acts establish the essential and only criteria for comparing and describing people who are unequal to one another. In other words, the issue of the equality of human beings in the Quran has nothing to do with ontological physical attributes like race, gender, and skin color. Humans, by virtue of being human, are fundamentally equal. This is an incontestable part of the Quranic ethos by default. When you survey many of these verses that deal with the issue of equality and inequality, it makes clear that in the Quran, it is the cultivation of personal virtues, such as righteousness, adherence to justice and devoutness, as well as sincerity and consistency in practicing charity and other good deeds, that are the ultimate criteria for determining a person's moral worth and standing. The one attribute that is most prominently invoked as indicating difference in status among humans is possession of knowledge in the broadest sense. Knowledge confers sight and insight, so that the difference between those who know and those who do not know is like the difference between the seeing person and the one who is blind. Again, none of these attributes is gendered or racialized, ethnicized, or tribalized. Each and every human being is capable of acquiring knowledge and carrying out acts of piety to the best of their ability, as stressed, for example, in Quran 2:286. For those who need to be assured of the non-gendered nature of the Quranic discourse on the equality of human beings based on their personal righteousness, which in Arabic is called taqwa, and on the commission of good deeds, their attention can be drawn particularly to Quran 33:35, which asserts that women and men earn the same heavenly rewards for the same acts of faith and piety. In relation to the manifestation of piety in social and political settings, another significant verse, Quran 9:71, declares men and women to be partners or allies of one another in commanding good and forbidding wrong, the fundamental moral imperative that undergirds Islamic morality and ethics. Now, I will be returning to a discussion of these two verses, Quran 33:35 and Quran 9:71, towards the end of my lecture. So where would patriarchy, which flagrantly posits the unequal status of women vis-a-vis men, fit into the Quranic ethos? We can all agree that patriarchy, in the words of the Canadian sociologist Dorothy E. Smith, refers to men's political and personal domination over women. It's a direct quote from her work. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to state that the Quran supports such a patriarchal regime based on all women's submission to all men and all women's acquiescence to all men's control over their lives. There is, after all, not a single Quranic verse that commands the unquestioning obedience of women to men as men, or of wives as wives to husbands as husbands. Although it may come as a surprise to many, the famous controversial verse, Quran 4:34, is actually the best evidence for arriving at this conclusion, as I will soon explain. Now, along with Quran 4:34, I will discuss another critical verse, Quran 2:28, that is frequently cited to make the case for patriarchy and to point to a lack of gender egalitarianism within the Quran. But first of all, a discussion of Quran 4:34. In her 2006 book, Inside the Gender Jihad, Amina Wadud bluntly counsels that we should say no to the command "Wadribuhunna" in Quran 4:34. Khalid Abul Fadl similarly expresses his discomfort with the specific wording of Quran 4:34 and says it should give us a conscientious pause. This is, however, not just a modern reaction. Classical male exegetes themselves appear to have been taken aback when encountering the verb daraba, so that they went to great lengths to explain that the verb referred to a light, symbolic tapping at best, that in no way should cause the errant wife any physical harm. The term daraba, in the sense of physical beating, after all, is highly discordant with the rest of the Quranic text, which shows considerable solicitousness toward women and other groups of people, prone to being victimized by those who are stronger and more powerful in society. And typically these have been adult males who have held the reins of power in traditional societies, and it must be said, continue to do so in less traditional societies, and even those that consider themselves to be progressive societies. The verse 4:34 further provokes feminist anxiety that it may be interpreted as mandating the submission of all women to all men and of all wives to all husbands. And this anxiety can be allayed by taking seriously the profound semantic difference between the description of women as qanitat in the earlier part of the verse and the verb atana, meaning they, feminine, obey, in the latter part of the verse. The unfortunate typical conflation of the two lexemes is a word with meaning in particular, of these two words in classical tafsir works, and even in some modern works, allows for the interpretation that first, women should be obedient to men in general, and second, that wives should be obedient to their husbands in general. But this conflation elides the fact that the verse specifically uses the verb atana only in connection with a specific and anomalous minority group of wives, the nashizat, who are guilty of a flagrant violation of their marital obligations, and not with women or wives in general. Now, if a marriage is a partnership, as is certainly indicated in Quran 2:187, that is infused with love, mercy, and tranquility, as stated in Quran 30:21, and if men and women in general are partners and allies in promoting what is good and preventing what is wrong, as stated in Quran 9:71, then a wife's failure to uphold her end of marital responsibilities must invite criticism, as it would for the husband. In other words, the wife's obedience to her husband in this specific instance is not a function of her gender, but is a consequence of her grievous misconduct that threatens to undermine their marriage, for which she is morally accountable. Her husband is not her overlord, who commands her unquestioning obedience, but her partner, to whom specific obligations are due, as stated in Quran 2:28. This kind of cross-referential reading of relevant verses allows the non-gendered nature of a human being's moral accountability and agency to emerge from within the Quran, and allows us to avoid the trap of superimposing culturally mediated notions of gendered hierarchical roles on the language of the Quran. The verse furthermore indicates that the Quran prefers that such instances of marital discord be first resolved by the couple themselves. The protocol that is outlined for the husband to correct the erring wife's behavior in such cases is geared towards this end. When the 3 steps fail to convince the errant wife to amend her ways, the next verse, 435, counsels the couple to seek arbitration. Within this ethos of seeking to set things right between the estranged couple, we must be willing to consider the potential multiple meanings of the verb daraba, which would accord better with the overall tenor of the Quran. The very polyvalence of the lexeme's root invites us to do so. The Quran, if I may remind, is after all very protective of a woman's rights within a marriage, as well as in larger social contexts, and anxious to protect her from harassment and harm. And one may be reminded here of certain verses, such as Quran 2:231, which warns husbands against mistreating their wives during divorce proceedings, Quran 24:23, which protects women from slander against them, Quran 24:4, which decrees punishment for those who resort to such slander, and Quran 81:8, which condemns the practice of female infanticide in the pre-Islamic period, when daughters were valued less than sons, and severely chides fathers who resorted to this reprehensible practice. And this is mentioned in Quran 16, verses 58 through 59. Canvassing a broader range of sources that use the lexeme daraba in different contexts is helpful in illustrating the much broader semantic landscape around this word. Now, such an exhaustive survey is not possible in this short presentation, but let us consider a well-known hadith from which a specific meaning of daraba can be extracted. In this report, the Prophet Muhammad is described as getting ready to dispatch Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen as its governor, and asks the latter, in other words, asks Mu'adh how he will govern. When Mu'adh's reply pleased him, the Prophet is said to have struck him on the breast, فَضَرَبَ صَدْرَهُ. Clearly here, the so-called striking is out of joy and connotes no intent of causing physical harm, and is best rendered into English as patting or tapping. The overwhelming majority of pre-modern exegetes who emphasize the symbolic nature of daraba in Quran 4:34, and modernist exegetes today who push back against the understanding of this verse as commanding wife beating, are actually on very firm semantic ground based on a good grasp of this word's polyvalence, multiplicity of meanings, and its use in multiple contexts. My preference for the translation or interpretation of wadribuhunna as and lightly tap them is based on these considerations. It is also highly significant that, similar to the directive contained in Quran 4:34, errant husbands, and 4:35, errant husbands described as guilty of nushuz in Quran 4:128 are also instructed to seek arbitration. It may be argued that wives are told not to directly censure the bad behavior of their errant husbands, the nashes, because of the obvious vulnerability of wives in such situations, especially if these husbands are already physically abusive toward them. Here it is appropriate to interject into our discussion the need to balance the demand for strict equality with the demand for retributive justice. A strict literal understanding of equality would have us looking for a similar directive in Quran 4:128, the one that refers to nushuz in husbands, allowing the aggrieved wife to discipline her husband in some manner. This allows us to ask if it would be just to impose this duty of disciplining the erring husband on the victim of abuse, here the wife, which could have life-threatening consequences for her. The moral and just answer has to be no. Society must step in to protect victims of injustice and oppression. The appeal to arbitration in Quran 4:128 is just such a measure to be undertaken by the collectivity in order to protect those who are vulnerable to abuse by those who are more powerful. Considerations of justice and equity may be similarly invoked when discussing the topics of inheritance and polygamy in the Quran. With regard to inheritance, if we were to adopt a purely bean counting approach, then the division of inheritance shares as described in Quran 4:11 through 12 would strike us as unfair, since the male is generally given 2 shares compared to the female, except in the case of parents who receive equal shares. Now, this last exception compels us to think of the rationale behind the apportionment of shares, ostensibly on the basis of gender. The Quran, in its own milieu, underscores the responsibility of men as the sole breadwinners to support their families. In other words, their economic dependents, traditionally wives and children, have a claim on whatever wealth they inherit. Women have no such economic obligations mandated for them. As is well known, married Muslim women hold on to their property in their own names and are not required to spend any part of it to support their families. The extra share apportioned for men can then be understood to take into consideration their additional economic responsibilities toward their families. This legal rationale for the disparity in inheritance shares would not apply to parents who need to be equally supported, especially in their old age. Similar considerations of justice arise in regard to polygamy, where men, once again, as the principal breadwinner in the pre-modern period, had the economic responsibility to look after especially widows and their orphan children, as the larger context of Quran 4:3 indicates. Paying attention to the larger thematic concerns within the Quran, particularly focused on the equality of all human beings and justice that is due to all, allows us to then meaningfully compare the first part of Quran 4:34 with the last part, and challenge the gendered hierarchy that has been read into this verse by pre-modern exegetes with very few exceptions. The pro-hierarchical reading is based on a certain interpretation of the critical term qanitat that occurs in the first part of the verse, an interpretation that found favor with the large majority of pre-modern male exegetes. These exegetes prefer to understand qanitat as a reference to wives who are obedient to both their husbands and God. A few, like Ibn Kathir, understood it to be a reference to wives who are obedient only to their husband, removing God altogether as the object of worship and devotion. There is no precedence for this in the Quran. Lexemes, or words derived from the root qaf, nun, ta, are not used in the Quran to describe in general women's obedience to men or any human to other humans. The one exception is Quran 33:31, where obedience to the Prophet is included along with obedience to God. In reference to Quran 30:26, which states, "To God belongs the earth and the heavens, and all are qanitun to him," end of quote. The well-known Arabic English dictionary known as Lane's Lexicon, which draws from classical Arabic dictionaries, explains the nature of obedience implied in qanitun, as occurs in this verse as, now I'm quoting from Lane, obedience to the will of God. The qanit is therefore the performer of the commands of God. The well-known 7th or 13th century Arabic dictionary, Lisanul Arab, describes the qanit as one who mentions God constantly, al-dhakir lillah ta'ala, and equates the qanitun with devout worshippers. This meaning remains constant regardless of whether the referent is a male or female worshipper. So here we may seize the opportunity to reflect on the atavistic sociocultural biases and preconceptions about normative gendered roles that allowed many of the pre-modern male exegetes, and surprisingly, even a few in the modern period, to automatically read not just wives, but women's general obedience to men into this verse, when such obedience in a general sense is not only not explicitly stated in this verse, but is clearly undermined by the usage of a word, qanitat, that in the Quranic milieu signals all women's direct obedience to God on an equal footing with that of all men. When Quran 434 in its latter part switches to the verb ata'na, only the nashizat, that is to say, only specific erring wives are indicated, not women or wives in general. Besides the Prophet, the only human beings to whom believing men and women owe their obedience are in the Quran the ulul amr, mentioned in Quran 459. Obedience in such instances is indicated by the use of verbal derivatives, specifically from the root ta, waw, ain. Since we're not told otherwise, and since Quran 971 describes men and women as being endowed with equal moral agency, and I will come back to this verse a little bit later, the ulul amr would include both women and men who have the requisite qualifications for holding positions of authority, namely knowledge and piety. In the Quran, these attributes are held to be attainable equally by women and men and confer on both groups moral and religious authority. The late 1st 7th century exegete Mujahid ibn Jabr understands ulul amr to be a reference to all the companions of the Prophet, which would naturally include both men and women. To make the case for a Quran-based patriarchy, we would also have to ignore the examples set by the pious wife of the Pharaoh of Egypt, who is called Asya in the exegetical literature, the Quran commentaries, who famously defied her tyrannical husband, as mentioned in Quran 66:11. This act of defiance is glorified in the Quran as an act of righteous resistance to evil and injustice. Asya is furthermore held up as an exemplar of righteousness for all those who believe, لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, not only for women. This is precisely because she upheld the Quranic ideals of piety and God consciousness, or taqwa, and heroically carried out the moral imperative of enjoining, commanding what is right and just against what is wrong and unjust, an imperative that is binding on both women and men. Praise for such wifely disobedience would be unthinkable within a patriarchy that is predicated on the unqualified domination of men over women. That is to say, regardless of men's personal attributes or adherence to norms of justice. Whether such moral activism is pleasing to a woman's husband or not is utterly irrelevant. The Quran recognizes the woman believer's primary loyalty to God as it does for a male believer. And let us not forget to note that Surah Al-Mujadila, chapter 58 of the Quran, takes a woman's complaint against her husband's conduct seriously and takes steps to improve the situation of wives by forbidding specific divorce pronouncements by husbands. There is no reprimand directed at the aggrieved wife for protesting the husband's treatment of her. Instead, the chapter launches into a critique of husbands who resort to unfair divorce practices carried over from the pre-Islamic period, the Jahiliyyah. Surat al-Mujadila can therefore be read as a clear and explicit endorsement of a wife's right to lodge a public complaint against her husband for unjust behavior on his part, and to expect that her grievance will receive a fair hearing. And finally, it is highly significant that in the cluster of verses in Quran 24, verses 6 through 10, referred to as the li'an verses, or the verses of mutual imprecation, when a husband resorts to accusing his wife of adultery and he has no witnesses, the wife's assertion of her innocence based on her own testimony is understood to override the husband's accusation. In other words, she has the last word, and no further action can be taken against her, although the marriage is assumed to have irreparably broken down. In a patriarchy where the wife's obedience to her husband and women's general subjugation to men is a given, the Quran's affirmation of the independent moral and legal agency of women in general that can be exercised against an unjust husband, ruler, or any other male authoritative figure in this and other verses should be read as striking a mortal blow against patriarchal regimes. Let me now go on to a discussion of whether the Quranic terms faddala and daraja can be understood as an indication of divine preference for men over women. To push back against egalitarianism, one may conceivably remonstrate, as many have and continue to do, that the verb faddala is used in the first part of Quran 434 and the noun daraja in Quran 2:28 may be interpreted to mean that men as a whole have been given preference over women as a whole. My examination now of the first part of Quran 434 is followed by a discussion of Quran 2:28 in order to assess the credibility of this remonstrance. So, onto a discussion first of faddala in Quran 434. To refresh our memory, the first part of this verse states, men are the economic providers for women because God has preferred faddala, some of them, over others, and because of what they spend of their wealth. Men's general preferential status over women has been traditionally derived by the classical male exegetes from the verb faddala. One can see how this meaning might be derived in a decontextualized manner. The verb faddala is derived from the Arabic root fa, dad, lam, which implies an excess of something and can connote preference. The noun fadl, derived from the same root, used in relation to God, refers to his bounty and grace. In relation to humans, fadl can refer to their specific attributes or endowments as conferred by God. The Quran uses faddala with different conjugations in 17 verses without any gendered connotations and without implying any ontologically superior status for those who are the recipients of divine fadl or bounty. The conferral of God's bounty always occurs selectively. Some humans are the recipients of specific forms of divine bounty, while others are not. Nowhere do we sense the implication that as a result, these groups of people are always superior to other groups of people, or that men as a whole are superior to women, or the reverse. For example, if you look at Quran 432, 2 verses before the much discussed 434, we note that the verse refers to some men and women who have been given more by God than others. Both women and men in this case earn the same reward for the meritorious actions they carry out as a result of this fadl. The larger obvious implication of this verse is that those women who have been so favored enjoy a preferential status over other men and women who are not the recipients of such bounties. Gender is not a determinant of such a favored status at all. Furthermore, 2 significant verses referring to the same group of people taken together disabuse us of the notion that certain kinds of divine fadl conferred on some implies an inferior ontological status for those who are not recipients of the same. I'm going to now move you to the next slide here. Okay. For example, in reference to prophets as a collectivity, Quran 1755 states, "We have preferred some of the prophets over others," end of quote. In another longer verse, Quran 2:53 says, "As for those messengers, we preferred some to others. To some of them God spoke directly, others he raised to degrees, darajat, and to Isa, or Jesus, the son of Maryam, we gave clear proofs and strengthened him with the Holy Spirit," end of quote. Compare these verses to Quran 2:85, which reads, "The messenger believes in what has been sent down to him from his Lord, as do the believers. Each one believes in God, his angels, his books, and his messengers. They say, we make no distinction between any of his messengers, and they say, we hear and we obey, and we seek your forgiveness, our Lord, and to you is the return," end of quote. Reading these verses together allows us to arrive at the conclusion that all the different prophets were endowed with different qualities and aptitudes, and thereby attained varying degrees of distinction, darajat. Muslims are not supposed to make any distinction between them because they are equally faithful and devout. In other words, having access to God's specific bounties and consequently raised to earthly stations of honor on their basis do not make particular individuals intrinsically superior to others. That is to say, the ontological and religious or moral equality of human beings is not compromised in any way on account of the different endowments that humans possess. Needless to say, as human beings, we're all differently endowed. With regard to natural attributes, some are more intelligent or analytical or more courageous than others. With regard to physical attributes, some are more attractive or stronger or more graceful than others. The classical male exegetes understood and accepted this implication of fadl when discussing Quran 2:253, but many fell back on atavistic cultural assumptions when discussing the connotations of fadl in Quran 4:34. And so we see this clearly when we compare the commentary of the 8th or 14th century exegete Ibn Kathir on the meanings and implications of faddala in Quran 2:253 with his commentary on Quran 4:34. So in his exegesis of Quran 2:253, Ibn Kathir, which refers to the fadl of the various prophets, Ibn Kathir refers to a hadith narrated by Abu Huraira, according to which a Muslim and a Jewish man were wrangling over the status of Muhammad versus Moses.
Jam në një seminar online edhe 40 minuta.
So when the Jewish man asserted that God had preferred Moses over all creation, the Muslim was outraged and struck him in the face. The Jewish man went to the Prophet and complained about the Muslim's conduct, upon which the Prophet instructed, "Do not give preference to me over other prophets." Among the inferences one can derive from this prophetic counsel, says Ibn Kathir, is that one should not base one's preferences merely on opinion and partisan sentiment, and that the calculation of any implied superiority based on such preferences is best left to the judgment of God. Ibn Kathir, however, fails to heed this counsel himself when he proceeds to comment on Quran 4:34. Instead, he has made up his mind that faddala in this verse, in contrast to its meaning in Quran 2:253, must mean that the group described as having a specific fadl, namely men, has an undisputed and inherently superior status vis-a-vis the group which lacks this specific fadl, namely women. Ibn Kathir arrogates to himself the right to make such a judgment, despite his warning that only God can pronounce on such assumed superiority. Thus, he goes on to declare that the man in general must be regarded as the woman's head, her elder, her ruler or judge, al-hakim alayha, and the one who disciplines her, mu'adhibuha, if she should stray. On the basis of this understanding, Ibn Kathir then proceeds to boldly assert that the male is superior to the female by virtue of being male. فَالرَّجُلْ أَفْضَلْ مِنَ الْمَرْأَةِ فِي نَفْسِهِ. A big jump from what the Quran is saying to where Ibn Kathir positions himself. Let me now go on to daraja. Besides Quran 2:253, the word daraja famously occurs in Quran 2:228, which states, and here I'm going to quote the verse to you in full, "Divorced women remain in waiting for 3 periods, and it is not lawful for them to conceal what God has created in their wombs if they believe in God and the last day. And their husbands have the right to take them back in this period if they want reconciliation. And the rights due to the women are similar to the rights upon them or the responsibilities they owe with regard to what is good and equitable ma'ruf, and the men have a degree or daraja over them, and God is exalted in might and wise." End of quote. Now, this is another verse popular with those who want to retrieve a gendered hierarchy from within the Quran. Daraja occurring in this verse has been traditionally understood by pre-modern exegetes to refer to a man's degree over a woman, implying, according to them, a fundamental superiority of the former over the latter. Now, one may again resort to a cross-referential reading of the Quranic text in order to determine whether this understanding can be supported on the basis of other verses in the Quran that use the term daraja. Now, there are 18 verses that contain the singular daraja or its plural darajat. Two of them are Quran 2:253 and 2:228, as I've already discussed. And I'm now going to mention a few additional ones. And again, in the interest of time, I'm kind of abbreviating this section. For example, Quran 46:19 says, everyone has a rank or degree. لِكُلٍّ daraja. And Quran 9:20 that states, the ones who believed, emigrated, and strove in the cause of God with their wealth and their lives are greater in rank in the sight of God. Another verse, Quran 16:6-165 states, for he it is who has appointed you vicegerent of the earth and has elevated you, some of you over others in degrees. Another verse says in Quran 43:32, is it they who apportion the mercy of their Lord? It is we who have apportioned the livelihood among them in the life of this world. And we have raised some above others in rank, daraja, so that some of them may harness others to their service. So for the verse, لِكُلٍّ daraja, it simply refers to the fact that everyone, regardless of gender, has a rank or degree in respect to others on the basis of the characteristics they possess and the merit of their actions. The second verse that I cited underscores the greater merit that accrues to those who embraced Islam in the early period and rendered great service to the Muslim community. None of these verses indicate any kind of a gender basis for daraja. Quran 43:32 refers to those who have greater financial resources and therefore have an edge or advantage over others who are not similarly monetarily privileged. And so these verses also do not link daraja to gender. Now, this broader perspective is helpful for better contextualizing the meaning of daraja in Quran 2:228. The relevant part of the verse asserts that wives, and since the context is clearly domestic, that wives have rights and duties vis-a-vis their husbands that are the equal of the rights and duties of husbands toward their wives. Husbands, however, have an edge or advantage over their wives. Given my earlier discussion of daraja, as it occurs in several verses, I'm interpreting this edge, as indicated in Quran 2:228, as a reference to men's greater ability to earn money and provide financial maintenance for their families. This edge is therefore purely functional and monetary in nature, and gendered only to the extent that in the pre-modern world, men were the principal breadwinners. There is not a whiff of ontological superiority attached to this functional and historically contingent edge that men typically have enjoyed over women in the domestic sphere by virtue of their status as breadwinners. More broadly, no Quranic verse that deploys the term daraja or darajat makes any ontological claims about those who possess such ranks or degrees. Based on the Quran, the argument that functional difference can imply an ontological one has to be categorically rejected. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit now in the time remaining to me about women outside of the domestic sphere, focusing primarily on Quran 4:34 and Quran 2:228 when talking about women, fosters the notion that women are only sexual and domestic beings. Women in the Quran are also cerebral, moral, ethical, and productive human beings who take part and are expected to take part in the grand human drama of human agency, fulfillment, and salvation unfolding throughout history. They are necessary actors in this drama without whose participation in Islamic history as part of this universal human story is inconceivable. This is not just an ideological assertion. The Quran addresses women along with men in its frequent vocatives. O those who believe, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, and O humankind, Ya ayyuhan nas, including women and men, as it instructs how humans should worship their creator and serve as stewards, khalifa, khulafa, of the earth. Two verses that celebrate women as actors in multiple spheres of life now need to be foregrounded as a corrective to an excessive emphasis on their familial and reproductive roles. First, Quran 33:35 remains the verse par excellence that establishes the equality of women and men in the sight of God on the basis of their moral excellences and deeds. It states, in full, those who have surrendered to God among males and females, those who believe among males and females, those who are devout among males and females, those who are truthful among males and females, those who are patient among males and females, those who fear God among males and females, those who give in charity among males and females, those who fast among males and females, those who remember God often among males and females, God has prepared for them forgiveness and a great reward. End of quote. This verse has been embraced particularly by many modern Muslim women exegetes who draw self-empowerment and self-validation from within the Quran itself. The verse, after all, asserts the complete spiritual and moral equality of men and women based on their faith, practice of specific virtues, and observance of their religious duties. Most exegetes record the following cause of revelation. In roughly the 3rd or 4th year of the Islamic era, which would correspond to 625 or 626 of the Common Era, the Medinan woman companion Umara remarked to the Prophet in connection with the Quranic revelations he had received up to that point, stating, I see that everything pertains to men. I do not see the mention of women. End of quote. Umara was commenting on the fact that Quranic verses that had come down so far primarily referred to men and their good deeds and their rewards in the next world. Were women believers not to be recognized as equal participants in the grand human and cosmic drama unfolding before them? The revelation of this verse, subsequently, proceeded to settle the question once and for all. Women and men have equal moral agency in their quest for the good and righteous life in this world, for which they reap identical rewards in the afterlife. Gender had no role to play in the salvific efficacy offered by the Quran through its prescription for the well-ordered moral and spiritual existence on earth. It is worth noting that this message of complete parity in the moral worth of actions, regardless of gender, is also repeated in a briefer form in Quran 3:195, in which God speaks, quote, I will not let the work of any of you, whether male or female, to be lost. Each of you is from the other. The second verse is Quran 9:71, which, like Quran 33:35, may be understood to have a broad general applicability, one of the verses that are considered am, or general, and to cover the whole gamut of activities that women may take part in as part of their God-given mandate to command what is right and good and prevent what is wrong and evil. The verse states, male believers, al-mu'minun, and female believers, al-mu'minat, are the partners or allies, awliya, of one another. They command the good and forbid wrong, and they perform prayer, give the obligatory alms, and obey God and his messenger. They are those upon whom God has mercy, indeed God is almighty and wise. End of quote. The obvious intent of the verse, based on its plain sense, is to establish parity between men and women as partners in the common venture to promote the good, righteous society on earth and to fulfill their individual and communal obligations toward God. But a majority of male interpreters from the pre-modern and modern periods understood this verse in ways that were consonant with their own particularist views of women's roles in the social and political contexts of their day. I'm going to offer you a sampling of the perspectives of a number of influential exegetes so as to offer you a glimpse into the conceptualization of such gendered identities in a variety of historical circumstances. So I'll move on to the next slide here. In the first half of the 2nd or 8th century, during the late Umayyad and early Abbasid periods, the exegete Muqatil ibn Sulaiman asserts the full and equal partnership of female and male believers in matters of religion, fiddin, and highlights their mutually reinforcing obedience to God in Quran 9:71. At-Tabari, the famous exegete from the Abbasid period in the early 4th or 10th century, similarly emphasizes that righteous men and women who believe in God, his messenger, and the verses of his book, to quote from him, are each other's helpers, ansar, and supporters, a'wan. Their fundamental duty to promote what is right and prevent what is wrong consists in inviting people to believe in one God and abandon the worship of idols and to carry out their fundamental religious obligations, such as offering prayers and paying alms, the zakat. The 5th, 11th century exegete al-Wahidi similarly underscores the complementarity of men and women's religious and familial roles to be indicated in this verse. He quotes from the famous companion Ibn Abbas, who stated that believing women and men were allies of one another in regard to mercy and affection, rahma wal mahabba. Al-Wahidi understands his statement to mean that they were like one hand in supporting one another, and like At-Tabari stresses, that they were particularly called to invite people to worship the one God and to themselves observe the fundamental tenets of Islam. And very similar views are expressed by the well-known Andalusian exegete Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Qurtubi, who on the basis of this verse characterizes the relationship between men and women as one of, quoting from him now, hearts united in mutual affection, love, and empathy, end of quote. The 8th or 14th century exegete Ibn Kathir, whom we met earlier, also comments on the special bond existing among believers in his exegesis of Quran 971 and invokes the hadith in which the Prophet describes the faithful as constituting a single edifice in which each strengthens the other. Moving on to the 20th century, the famous Egyptian exegete and reformer Rashid Rida provides a more detailed explanation of the nature of wilaya, or partnership, indicated in the verse, and how that applies to men and women. As far as their fundamental relationship is concerned, Rida states, the wilaya that exists between believing men and women, according to this verse, has to do in general with mutual support, solidarity, and affection. And he also invokes hadiths as proof texts to describe how the community of Muslims exists as one body, and therefore the alliance of support, or wilayatul nusra, between women and men is specifically constituted so that all may collaborate in defending truth, justice, the religious community, and the nation. Rida, therefore, when compared with the pre-modern exegetes, appears to consider men and women to be equally engaged in their efforts to promote what is right and prevent what is wrong, and in different spheres of life. The pre-modern exegetes, however, restricted women's roles, in particular in tandem with men, mainly to the religious and moral sphere. This mutual alliance for the common good, however that common good may be interpreted in various times and places, may be seen as more than subversive of patriarchy. In fact, it may be understood to completely dismantle it. Not surprisingly, this notion of wilaya, or equal partnership or alliance, is robustly invoked by many Muslim gender scholars and feminist practitioners today to underscore what they understand to be the Quran's prescient gender egalitarianism that is particularly resonant in the modern period. As Asma Afsaruddin, a prominent Moroccan reformer and advocate of women's rights, remarks, and I'm quoting now, in today's social context, it is time to reclaim the Quranic concept of wilaya as a principle that dictates responsible and constructive membership and participation of women and men in society, end of quote. Let me now turn to a quick discussion of Quran 2:82, which I'm describing as the last attempt to restrict women. And this is another verse that was popular with the pro-hierarchy camp. So those who are determined to find evidence in the Quran of a woman's ontologically inferior status vis-a-vis that of a man have another favorite verse to point to, and this is Quran 2:82. And the verse states, set up 2 witnesses from your own men, and if there are not 2 men, then choose a man and 2 women as witnesses, so that if one makes a mistake, then the other can remind her, end of quote. despite the fact that the context in which this verse is embedded refers to a very specific kind of financial enterprise. It's a loan transaction, dain in Arabic. The verse has been invoked by some as a proof text to establish that a woman's legal testimony in general is worth half that of a man. And this disparity is assumed to stem from her tendency to be forgetful and to not be as mentally incompetent as a man. Therefore, Ibn Kathir, in the 14th century of the Common Era, has no reservations about saying that two women take the place of one man in legal testimony because of, and I'm not quoting from him, the deficient intelligence of the woman. لِنُقْصَانِ عَقْلِ الْمَرْأَةِ. In their discussion of this verse today, many gender scholars emphasize a distinction between the general and the particular, and how the general cannot be derived from the particular. So, in this vein, they typically argue that the specific context of Quran 2:82 highly restricts its applicability, especially in the modern world. The assumption of a woman's incompetence in financial transactions in the pre-modern world, where such competence would have been rare, had no bearing in other matters where she may have competency equal or superior to a man's. For example, in hadith transmission or in childbearing matters. In fact, in the field of hadith transmission, with its rigorous standards of moral probity and accurate oral transmission, the individual testimony of women narrators about the reliability of hadiths they related from the Prophet was frequently and freely accepted when they met this high bar. It should also be remembered that Quran 24 verses 6 through 10, known as the Li'an verses, accepts a single woman's testimony as valid and as decisively overturning her husband's accusation of adultery. So in conclusion, in regard to the Quran, the prime concern among gender scholars is whether the Quran may be understood to be a gender egalitarian text or one that ultimately condones patriarchy and upholds a form of gendered hierarchy in which men are deemed to be ontologically and morally superior to women. My analysis of relevant texts and arguments emanating from both pro-egalitarian and pro-hierarchical stances leads me to the conclusion that the pro-egalitarian position is the more credible and cogent one. I find no incontrovertible proof or persuasive argument that makes the case for a patriarchal and hierarchical ethos within the Quran. To support such an ethos, the Quran would have to posit the ontological inferiority of women to men, stipulate that all women or wives obey all men or husbands, a sine qua non, an absolutely required feature of patriarchy, value male worship and deeds higher than women's, and restrict the acquisition of knowledge and access to moral and social goods only to men. In my exploration of this topic, I find that the Quran affirms the exact opposite of these positions. I perceive three main problems in pro-hierarchy discourses as follows. First, the functional, circumscribed so-called superiority of the male, especially within the domestic sphere, that is contingent on his status as the sole financial provider in the pre-modern period, has been mistaken for a general and ontological superiority. Second, the subversive function of qunut in establishing women's direct access to God without the mediation of men, established throughout the Quran, and as powerfully evident, for example, in the case of Asya, the pious disobedient wife of the Pharaoh, receives scant attention. And third, the revolutionary potential of Quran 971 as the gender egalitarian verse par excellence that has broad sweeping applicability, particularly in the modern period, has not been fully appreciated. Instead, the fixation with Quran 434 and what I understand to be misreadings continue to dominate and derail conversations on the topic of Islam and women. There is no doubt that believing Muslim women who are seeking empowerment and self-actualization from within their own faith tradition will continue to engage primarily with the Quran because they understand that only God's words can transcend the banality of gendered inequality constructed by humans and thereby ensure their rights. And I want to end with these memorable words from Asma Barlas. And she says, quoting directly from her now, "There's a relationship between what we read text to be saying and how we think about and treat real women. This insight, though associated with feminists because of their work on reading and representation, is at the core of Revelation, albeit in the form of the reverse premise, that there's a relationship between reading sacred texts and liberation. Accordingly, if you wish to ensure Muslim women their rights, we not only need to contest readings of the Quran that justify the abuse and degradation of women, we also need to establish the legitimacy of liberatory readings. This is why women must remain engaged in this hermeneutic process of deriving liberatory and empowering readings from scripture. The stakes are, of course, much higher than those of men, and it is part and parcel of their divinely mandated duty to command what is good and noble and prevent what is wrong and ignoble. And given the fact that we might have a little time left for Q&A, before we switch to that, I want to direct your attention to my very last slide, a completely shameless plug for my recently edited volume that Amina referred to that came out from Oxford University Press in late 2023. It's a collection of articles, or chapters rather, on many different topics. As you might imagine, the topic Islam and women is huge. If you have the time, I encourage you to take a look at the chapters. And the talk today, my presentation today was basically a summary and an overview of the arguments that I present in my chapter on rereadings of the Quran by Muslim women scholars and exegetes. So thank you very much for your attention. And for a short discussion, but I'll turn the floor over to you and I guess to Amina, who will be conducting the Q&A.
Yes, Amani here. Hi everyone. We are back to the class discussion now. Dr. Asma, that was quite a fascinating presentation, and you managed to really dig deep into a very wide spectrum of I think topics that have naturally come up for so many Muslim women when it comes to this discourse about the Quran and gender. I'm also very grateful that you've left us about 15 minutes for questions. And so sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. I would rather give the opportunity to the students to take advantage of the time that they have left with you right now. So is there anyone that has a question for Dr. Asma? Please feel free to put your hand up and I will call on you accordingly. And please feel free to turn on your camera or jump in via audio and ask your question directly. Tamara's the first person that I saw put her hand up. And guys, you can put your hand up in the Zoom call, so it'll show a symbol next to your image, and that'll indicate to me that you'd like to go next. But please, Tamara, go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Dr. Asma. It was really fascinating getting an overview of all these verses. I wasn't really...
Can you turn up your volume just a little bit? You're a little soft.
I think my microphone is just not very...
That's better. Maybe lean in a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I'll introduce myself quickly since I didn't really do that before. So I have a background in Islamic studies and I'm a writer mainly. And my research has mainly been about Sufism, recently more specifically about jihad in the Sufi tradition and in the Quran. So that's my main interest. But I'm also really interested in how to apply Quranic guidance to modern debates. And one of the things I was thinking about is how to apply these ideas to debates about the gender binary, for example, because I have the impression that it doesn't really specify what a woman is or what a man is, and I'm just wondering how one can approach modern debates about the gender binary, basically, because I have the impression that in order to understand what equality is and what a woman is, what a man is, we have to define that. If that makes sense.
Yes. Yes, that's a very good question. It's not something I've specifically worked on, but if you're extracting general principles from the Quran itself. Now, of course, we have the creation story, particularly in Quran 4:1, which I didn't deal with in my presentation, but I do talk about it in my own chapter in the Oxford Handbook that I referred to. The creation story is remarkably different from, say, the biblical version, right? Because it talks about how male and female were actually generated from a nafs wahida, right? So a single soul then splits up into its mate, but there's no gender hierarchy implied in that, because it doesn't say that the male preceded the female or the female preceded the male. It actually leaves the gender of the nafs wahida from which flows all human beings and its mate also undetermined. So obviously, since these questions have surfaced only in the modern period, there are a number of people, a few, who are looking at this whole notion of how is actually gender conceived of within the Quran itself. Of course, we know that gender is always a construct, right? It's society that constructs gendered identities, and they apply certain attributes to what they consider to be, the quintessential male attributes versus quintessential female attributes. That's all socially and culturally constructed. And those attributes or constructions can change over time. And as we know, they have, right? Today, we conceive of women as being capable of discharging all kinds of different responsibilities that would not have occurred to our pre-modern exegetes, right? So even when Quran 971 talks about the partnership of women and men, the pre-modern exegetes could not have foreseen a world where it might be possible for women to be equally active participants in the public sphere, in government, in ruling over their societies and being engineers and doctors and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So what we really should be concerned with are the general principles, the meaning, the general meaning of verses versus the more specific and circumscribed meanings that are contingent on historical circumstances. So the example I gave about how Quran 2:28 was used as a way of limiting women's legal enfranchisement or their ability to give legal testimony based on a misunderstanding of what the verse was actually saying. It was only talking about a specific loan transaction, right? But if you read the Quran holistically, if you bring in Quran 33:35, which says that, women and men are actually absolutely equal in the kind of deeds they can carry out and the moral worth of their actions and so forth. Typically, pre-modern exegetes did not read the Quran cross-referentially and link verses to the overall ethos, the overall gestalt, the spirit that animates the Quran, but rather sometimes read these verses atomistically and sometimes too literally. So it's still a work in progress, Tamara, but it's a great question to ask. And, keep an eye out for more work that's continuing to come that questions, some of the pre-modern assumptions about gendered behavior and gendered identities.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you for that question, Tamara. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So there are two individuals with their hands up, Haq and Sanjida. Haq, I would like to give you the chance to contribute to the discussion. So please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. It's a very nice interpretations from the institutions and from Professor Afsaruddin. And just a few questions, not a few questions in collaborating with that effect of question and the answers which you have given. And don't you think that the tafsir or the exegesis needs to be more ease way for the interpretation, or I quote, the misinterpretation of the Quran in mass? That's my question. Would it be more flexible, no?
Well, that was kind of the whole point of my presentation, to show that the interpretations that are recorded for us in the pre-modern, right, tafsir works you're referring to, are not the last word, are not the last word on this topic. In fact, there's plenty of room for reinterpretation, which is exactly what women exegetes and feminist scholars are doing. And so my presentation was to give you an idea of how these interpretations are proceeding and how they're actually proceeding to critique some of these, and I call them readings, but misinterpretation, but some of the interpretations that were taken for granted in the pre-modern period because of the fact that I think male experts simply not imagine a more egalitarian and expansive role for women, whether it is in the domestic sphere or whether it is in the public sphere. But those possibilities are really open now because we can imagine a much more egalitarian understanding of the Quran and how that would resonate in our own contemporary period. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, thanks a lot, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that question. Sanjida, we will go ahead and wrap up the Q&A today with your question. And just so everybody knows, we will have plenty of opportunities to dig deeper into some of these conversations in the lectures to come. So don't feel discouraged if we didn't get to you today. But please, Sanjida, go ahead.
Thank you, Mani. Thank you, Dr. Asma, for this really enlightening session. I really liked your presentation on how you talked about the cultural interpretation and the contextual practices within various Muslim societies. So I'll be very quick with my question. I thought this was really important because I research about literature and religion, so the interface between literature and religion. So my question is, because we have read across religious tradition that God is often referred to using masculine pronouns. So these linguistic choices have historically reinforced patriarchal structures by aligning divinity with masculinity, shaping societal perceptions of authority, leadership, and power as inherently male. So what do you have to say regarding this?
Actually, very little. Because the Quranic text is the Quranic text, right? And the answer is, I know others have been asked this question. The answer finally is, if you believe in the Quran as a revelation, this is how God chose to disclose himself in the Quran, right? Having said that, it does not mean that at the human realm and on the earthly realm, that implies any kind of a hierarchy. If anything, if you read the Quran as a divine revelation, you find that, and if you go through it very carefully, focus on the words. I was stunned by how male exegetes could read qunut, or when it refers to women as qanitat, those who are devoutly obedient and adoring of God, how they would read obedience to human beings in the middle of that. It doesn't make sense. Think about Mary, for example, right? Mary is a supreme example of a qanita, one who had wholly devoted herself to God. She did not have a husband. Why does the husband even factor in women's devotion to God? This insertion of a cultural bias on the part of the male exegete is just stunning. Now, I did find an outlier in my survey of exegetes who dealt with the notion of qunut in relation to women, Al-Baydawi. And he's, again, just one of very few male exegetes in the pre-modern period who noticed that qanit, when he refers to men as devout worshippers, always describes them as devout worshippers of God. Why would that meaning suddenly change in relation to women? That doesn't make sense. And then how do we apply it to Mary when we know that Mary was unmarried? She was a virgin mother, and there is a whole chapter devoted to her piety and her virtues. So this is the kind of critical reading that we should engage in. I think sometimes we get very fixated on one or two little things and let that determine our worldview. So people have gotten so fixated in 434 and the meaning of daraba that they've lost sight of the fact that daraba can mean so many different things in different contexts, right? Why would we choose that particularly injurious meaning, harmful meaning of the possibility of wife beating in the usual sense, actually hitting her to cause her physical harm? Why would that even be possible in the Quranic ethos? I just don't think it is. It simply cannot. It simply doesn't jibe with the rest of the Quran's very solicitous attitude towards women, its anxiety to protect her from harm and degradation, right? And frankly speaking, it makes a difference when women readers are engaged in this process. We really have to have women exegetes involved in this process. This kind of questioning did not arise until women's scholars primarily went back to the Quran, kind of circumventing the whole tafsir tradition, deciding to read the Quran for themselves and not through the prism of medieval exegesis. And the results have been absolutely stunning, right? So let's not get fixated on just pronouns. Let's not get fixated on just a few words. Let's focus on a holistic reading of the Quran, which ultimately I think is much more rewarding, much more illuminating, and actually much more self-affirming, I think, for both women and men. And that's important.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Dr. Asma. If I may, just for a quick moment, we're at time now, but that did inspire me with 2 points that I wanted to share that hopefully we can carry with us in the lectures to come. I personally believe that Maryam alayhi salam was a prophet. She received divination directly from Allah, and also she has an entire Quran dedicated to her. And there's a lot of feminist theory around the fact that she is a prophet, but unfortunately was not remembered or regarded as such in contemporary Islam, that I encourage everyone to look into. It's quite mind-opening when you really get into it. And the other thing that I was reminded of by one of the contributions in the chat by, who was this last person? Julius, is that the two names of Allah that we say the most commonly, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, that the core letters of Rahman and Rahim's Rahm, which means a womb in Islam. And in that way, Allah feels very directly connected to this like divine, motherly type of energy that I think also is very highly regarded. We tend to, a lot of times in our patriarchal interpretation of Allah, we tend to focus on, like the kind of the tougher and justice-oriented aspects of Allah's names, when there are so many that are very compassionate and are more feminine, so to speak. So I encourage you also to look into that as well, because it's quite fascinating. With that, Dr. Asma, I want to give my sincere thanks to you for guiding us through this profound and enlightening exploration today. I think I can speak on behalf of the entire class when I say that the insights that you shared with us really are a great reminder that when we return to the Quran with this critical and compassionate lens, it's not just an intellectual exercise, as I'm sure you would agree with me, but also it is a very much rooted within our spiritual empowerment and our collective liberation, not just as Muslim women, but really as an ummah as a whole. So thank you so much for taking the time to share such detailed insights with us. I really hope they're of benefit to everyone listening. And to our students, I really hope that today's session inspired you to continue engaging deeply with the Quranic texts. Claim your own relationship with it. That to me is like true spirituality empowerment. So for tomorrow, we are going to continue building on these foundations. We started with the history of feminism. Today, we dug into the Quranic interpretations on gender and women's issues. We're going to continue exploring topics at the intersection of gender, power, and justice in Islamic thought tomorrow. And we will be having that discussion with Dr. Zahra Ayyubi. So it's going to be quite a riveting discussion, and it's going to directly build on a lot of the points that we have started yesterday and continued today with Dr. Asma. So I will look forward to seeing you all then. In the meantime, thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day wherever you are, and we will reconvene again soon, inshallah. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you, Amani and Mahmoud, for your hosting this event. I really enjoyed this, talking to you. I wish we had more time for the question. Amani, I just realized in the chat someone asked for a copy of my chapter from the Oxford Handbook. I'm happy to send that along if you want to share it with all the students. Would that be possible?
Sure.
Yeah, I
Yes,
also
please, sure.
think someone in the chat also asked for the transcript of your talk as well. So if you have that and you'd like to send that to Mahmoud, I'm sure you know we would
Well,
be
the
happy to make
chapter
it available to the
actually
students.
has all the detailed arguments that I had to cut out of my talk. So maybe that
Perfect.
would be more profitable. Yes.
Fantastic.
Okay, I will do that. All right. Thank you again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Sure.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Amani.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Talk soon.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and see you tomorrow, inshallah.